everyone. Today is the day that I'm going to show you how I make my sourdough bread. I want to start off this video by letting you guys know I am not a professional baker by any means. I just do it for myself and my family. I've been making sourdough bread now for a little bit over a year. I started my sourdough starter a little over a year ago and have been baking bread ever since. When I first started making sourdough bread and creating the starter, everything seemed really daunting and overwhelming and just overcomplicated. Sourdough really doesn't need to be complicated. It actually can be very simple. It's very methodic. It does take quite a bit of time. It's definitely so worth it. It's very rewarding and it is so delicious. It's a much healthier bread than purchasing a store-bought bread full of preservatives and other ingredients. But again, I want to let you know, don't be scared to make sourdough bread. Don't feel overwhelmed. I'm here to help you. I really make it simple for myself. I don't overthink it, and I really do believe that is the trick to successful sourdough. So I'm gonna start off by showing you guys exactly what you need to make a sourdough loaf. It's not complicated, you don't need very much, but what you do need, one thing that's super important, is you do need an established sourdough starter. So whether it's a starter that you made on your own, which by the way, let me know if you would like me to make a separate video on how to create your very own sourdough starter. I created mine. It definitely took a lot of trial and error. You can ask a neighbor to, if they have a sourdough starter, you can maybe get some off of them. So definitely check maybe your local Facebook groups if there's anyone in your neighborhood or your area that has an established starter, if it's something that you don't want to make on your own. All your starter is water and flour that ferments over time and cultivates a good bacteria that's going to allow your bread to rise. So the starter is definitely a very crucial part to your sourdough bread. So I have my starter right here in this big jar. As you can see, it doesn't look like I have a ton of starter, but this is actually doubled in size. I fed it last night. It's nice and bubbly and active. It also smells really good. It smells like sourdough. And I actually transferred my starter into this larger jar. So when I transferred it, I only had maybe like 20-30 grams of starter, and then I fed it with water and flour. So that's why it doesn't, like, it's not filling the whole entire jar. It only started out about right here, so it has doubled in size. And again, I fed it last night knowing that I wanted to make bread this morning, so it is ready to use. The next ingredient you will need is obviously bread flour. I like to use this organic bread flour. I just purchased it at my local health food store. And then the only two other ingredients that you will need is water and salt. This is a local sea salt. Again, I get it at my health food store, and you want to use a filtered water. The next two things you will need is a mixing bowl and a scale. And then of course, one more thing, you will need a spatula. I love this one. It's from Amazon. I can link it below on my Amazon storefront. So the recipe that I'm using today, I will link below. I prefer using a food scale to measure out my ingredients. I just find it's more accurate that way. But this recipe is really nice because if you don't have a food scale, it also shows you cup measurements. I've tried that before when I didn't have a food scale. I did cup measurements. It worked fine. But again, I just find that the food scale gives me a little bit more of an accurate measurement. The first thing we're going to do is put our mixing bowl on the food scale and tare it so that it's completely zeroed out. And then what I like to do is I like to add my water first. So we're going to be adding 310 grams of warm filtered water. It doesn't have to be super warm, more like room temperature, just as long as it's not cold. Next thing you're going to add to your sourdough mixture is 120 grams of your active starter. This adds up to be about a half cup, and you can tell if your starter is ready to use. If it floats, that is one indication letting you know that it is ready. I like to mix the water and the starter together before I add my other ingredients. Next, you're going to add 500 grams of your bread flour, and then you're going to want to put in 16 grams of your fine sea salt, which is about 2 teaspoons. I'm gonna mix this up with as much as I can, and if I need to, I will go in and mix it with my hands. You just wanna make sure that you don't see any dry bits of flour left over. You want it to be mixed up really well. Okay, so now that all of our ingredients are mixed up, your dough is probably going to look something like this. It's not overly smooth, but there are no dry bits of flour. It's all mixed together. And now what we're gonna do is I'm gonna take a bowl cover. If you have like a tea towel or like a dishcloth or something, just throw that over top. But I'm gonna cover mine with my bowl cover. I'm gonna let this sit for 1 hour. This helps the ingredients to all blend together. It's also gonna help kickstart the gluten development. So it helps just with the flavor, just the overall blend of all the ingredients. You just want it to really sit and develop. After that 1 hour of it sitting, I'm gonna do my first stretch and fold. So I will come back after 1 hour and we will do our first round of stretch and folds. All right, so our dough has been sitting for an hour now and we are gonna start our stretch and folds. If you aren't sure what stretch and folds are, it's basically going to help develop a stronger gluten structure in the bread to just give you a really nice, fluffy, chewy, just like a really nice overall structure to the bread. And it's gonna help to give your bread a really nice texture as well. This recipe calls for 4 stretch and folds every 20 minutes. So that's what I typically always do. I do like to wet my hands with some water, so I just have a little bit of water in my measuring cup and I have my dough. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to dip my hands in the water just to get them a little bit damp. And I'm going to grab my dough and do my first stretch and fold. So basically you're going to want to scoop up the dough in your hand and stretch it out as much as you can without breaking the dough. And then once you've done your first stretch, you can turn your bowl, do another stretch, and all around the dough, it takes about 4 stretches. I'm going to stretch, fold it over, stretch it, fold it over, and you're gonna wanna do this all around the dough until you've kind of created a nice little round ball. So I've done my first stretch and folds. I'm going to put the bowl cover back on, let that sit for 20 minutes, and come back and do my second round of stretch and fold. All right, so it's been 20 minutes. So we're going to do the exact same thing as we did before. We're just gonna do our second round of stretch and fold. So I'm gonna wet my fingers, scoop up the dough and stretch it as much as I can, fold it over, turn the bowl, stretch, fold, turn, stretch, fold, turn. And you'll notice the more stretch and folds you do, the harder it becomes to really stretch it out. And that is a good thing. That means your dough is developing really nicely. Okay, cover that back up, come back in 20 minutes, and we have 2 more sets of stretch and folds. Okay, so we are on our final stretch and fold. This is stretch and fold number 4. And again, we were doing this every 20 minutes, 4 times. Our dough looks a little bit different than when it first did, when we first mixed it together. So after our final stretch and fold, as you can see, I shaped my dough into a little bit of a ball. So now we are going to do what is called the bulk rise. I'm going to cover my bowl again, and I'm going to let it sit for anywhere from like 6 to 8-ish hours. It honestly depends on your environment. For example, I am in Canada. I am in a colder climate. So it might take my dough a little bit longer to rise. The warmer your climate is, the quicker it will rise. To put my dough in my oven with the light on, but do not turn your oven on. You don't want to bake your dough. I just find when I put it in the oven with the light on, it creates a really nice, warm and cozy environment for the dough, and it really just allows it to rise nicely. So this bulk rise is your bulk fermentation. And in this time, the dough is really going to strengthen and it's going to allow it to rise. Once my dough has doubled in size, I will check back in with you guys and we will go from there. Okay, so as you guys can see, my dough has risen pretty nicely. It's only been about 4 hours. I could probably let it sit for another hour or so, but to be completely honest with you guys, and for the sake of this video, I do have to do daycare pickup pretty soon. I have to go get our kiddo, And once that happens, I just won't have time to film this once she's home and we're just in the midst of like dinner prep and everything. So for the sake of today's video, I am going to go ahead and start shaping after 4 hours of rising. But I mean, it really is looking pretty good. So what we're going to do now is the shaping process. This is also the process where you would want to add any inclusions, or at least this is when I would add them. So for example, if you wanted to do like a rosemary garlic loaf, you would add those inclusions in during the shaping process, or like jalapeno cheddar, whatever flavors you want to include. This is when I would. So I'm going to just lightly flour my clean surface. And I am going to take my bench scraper. Again, I will link all of my tools down below in my Amazon storefront, and just scrape the dough out of the bowl. And then I like to dust a little bit more flour on, just so that it's not overly sticky. So if you were to add any inclusions, I would stretch the dough out into like a big rectangle shape. But since I'm not doing any inclusions today, I'm just going to shape it. There's so many different ways to shape your dough. This is just how I do it. And then we're going to give it a little bit of tension. Look at these bubbles. Look at these bubbles. And this also helps to shape the dough as well. I don't know why this is like my favorite part. It's so satisfying. The bubbles just keep popping. Okay. So then I'm going to cover this with a tea towel. You can also use just a paper towel. And I'm going to let this sit for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then I will show you the next step. Okay, so our dough has been sitting for about 30 minutes now. So now what we're gonna do is called cold proofing. I personally like to put my dough in the fridge overnight and then bake it the next morning. It just allows the dough to rise a little bit more and do more of like a cold fermentation, so that it slows down the process of it rising. And it just kind of allows me to bake it at a more convenient time. You can keep it in the fridge for up to 24 hours. I personally keep it in the fridge overnight. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in a Banneton bowl. You can use any large bowl that you have. You can use a bowl cover or a cloth. I'm just gonna use this little towel, this little tea towel, and then I'm going to line that with some flour just so that it doesn't stick to the bowl. Be generous, line it with your flour, and then I'm going to go ahead and pick up the dough. I like to use my bench scraper to pick this up, flip it over, and then I like to pinch the seams together. And then what you're going to want to do is cover it either with some plastic wrap, or I have a specific plastic bag that I always use, so I'm going to go grab that. And tie it off. And we're going to put this in the fridge. Morning, it's the next day. Today we are going to bake our dough. So I'll sort of talk you through the steps of baking our sourdough. First thing you're gonna wanna do is grab your Dutch oven and put it in the oven while your oven preheats. Make sure you preheat your oven to 500 degrees. Having the Dutch oven in there while it's preheating just allows it to really get nice and hot and create the perfect environment for your dough. Once your oven is preheated, I like to take my dough out of the fridge, grab a piece of parchment paper to put the dough on, and then you're going to score your dough. The reason why we cut into the dough is that the dough has a lot of room to expand and grow, and you can do fancy little score designs on them. There are a bunch on Pinterest that you can look at and try to do on a regular basis. I personally don't do any fancy little designs. I just do my one big score. And all of these tools that I'm using, I will link below in my Amazon storefront. Once you have your dough scored, you're going to plop that into your Dutch oven. Be careful when you take your Dutch oven out of the oven, make sure you have your oven mitts on. It's going to be super hot. Once we put our dough into the oven, I'm going to reduce the heat to 450 degrees and I'm going to bake it for 20 minutes. Once that 20 minutes is up, I'm going to take the lid off and bake it for another 20 minutes. Once your bread is all baked and ready, you can go ahead and take it out of the oven. I like to let mine sit for about 2 to 3 hours before I cut into it personally. I've seen some people cut right into it right away when they take it out of the oven. I just find if I cut into it while it's still hot, it can kind of turn out a little bit gummy. So I personally let it sit for a couple hours before I dive in. It's hard, trust me. It's hard to wait. Honestly, you guys, that's it. That's how I make my sourdough bread. I know that there are so many different recipes and methods of making sourdough bread, but this is just personally what has worked for me for over a year now. As mentioned before, I am not a professional baker by any means. And I also just want to remind you that your bread doesn't have to be perfect. As mentioned before, I don't overthink it. And I think that's what works best for me. For example, for the sake of the video, I did my stretch and folds every 20 minutes because I wanted to show you guys how to do them. But honestly, on a regular basis, I might forget to do my stretch and folds, or I might only do 1 or 2 stretch and folds. I'm a mom, I'm a working mom. The day gets away from me sometimes, and it doesn't have to be perfectly every 20 minutes on the dot. Sometimes I'll do a stretch and fold after 30 minutes or 40 minutes or 10 minutes. Just whenever I kind of think of it, it's always gonna turn out fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. It will turn out just fine. I always tell people, just bake the dough. It doesn't have to turn out perfect. It doesn't have to look beautiful. It's going to be edible. So no matter what, even if you think you missed a step or messed something up, just bake it. My advice is don't overthink it. Again, if you need a sourdough starter, see if a neighbor has one, see if you can purchase a dehydrated starter online, or as mentioned before, I will be making a video soon on how to create a sourdough starter. Thank you guys so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're going to be making your first loaf of sourdough bread, be sure to use this video, follow it step by step, and comment down below if you have any questions at all, or if you use a different recipe or different methods. I would love to hear it. Comment below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you want to see more from me, and I will see you guys in the next one.